IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, and welcome to the All Things Policy. And with me, I have Shambhavi and Sunila discussing about the ethical guidelines for clinical trials and research in India. Now, in the recent instances of COVID-19, we have seen soldiers being vaccinated and a lot of instances where people have been given vaccines without clinical trials. But even the president of US going through the antibody cocktail as of now, we are kind of missing the plot in terms of figuring out how the ethical guidelines for these things are going to pan out. So I would now have Shambhavi and Sunila talk about why ethics are so crucial in the clinical trials and what it entails.
Thanks, Sowmya. Ethics are values and principles that serve as a guide for people to decide what is essentially good or bad for individuals and society. And they form one of the most important parts of research in general and clinical trials in particular, because in clinical trials, we are actually performing experiments on human beings. Like, we are not giving them approved treatments, but we are trying to see if the treatments work at all or not. So essentially, ethics guide the moral compass of researchers, ensuring the protection of both the dignity and rights of the participants and the integrity and effectiveness of the research study.
Yeah. So now moving on from there, right? Like, while you've laid out why it's important, let's also hear from you guys in terms of history, how things have evolved, especially to do with the ethical side of the trials itself.
I think when it comes to science experimentation, there have always been like these big episodes of inequality, injustice that have kind of jolted public consciousness, necessitating that we have ethical guidelines included. And there have been some really, really like bad episodes. We obviously had the doctors from the Nazi regime using a variety of different demographies as subjects to further their own understanding of science. And I think Sunila will talk about it a little bit more in detail. I just wanted to pick out this one incident that I think helped jolt the US consciousness. And this was an incident at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York. It's a school for children with mental retardation. And these children were given hepatitis intentionally, in an attempt to try the development of the infection and understand the disease better. And it was justified that this was given to them. Then they were given some experimental treatments as well for gamma globulin injections. And the justification was that, hey, there's a high rate of infection in this institution anyway, so the children might anyways get it. So why we don't just give it to them deliberately and then trial this gamma globulin injection on them. And after this happened in the early 1950s. After this, there was a recognition that, hey, no, this is not okay. And we really, really need to think through our clinical trials better, and that our clinical trials have to lead to some sort of benefit for the intended participant.
So 1947 was the year when the significance of ethics actually came to the fore. It was when the Nuremberg Code was formulated in response to the torturous human experiments that were being conducted by the doctors of Nazi regime. So we all know how the Nazi regime was, and the human rights were not given any regard at all. And in response to that, so this all came to the fore during the Second World War. And that's how the Nuremberg Code was formulated, which talk about the basic human rights that need to be protected whenever any kind of research is being conducted involving them. And since then, the Nuremberg Code has majorly influenced the approach countries all over the world have taken to formulate their ethical guidelines for research. Following 1947, the World Medical Association, they passed the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which is a statement of ethical principles to provide guidance to physicians and other participants in medical research involving human subjects. Following the Declaration of Helsinki, there were many other statements and declarations that were passed to and encourage better ethical compliance in the research. In 2005, UNESCO came up with the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which stated that research cannot be solely rooted in scientific practices, but we also need to take into account the cultural and psychosocial factors, because we really need to take into account people's beliefs and their cultural practices, because even if we may not agree with them, we cannot just ignore it, because we need the cooperation of people while conducting research. So that was that in 2005. And following all of these international developments, there were some developments happening in India as well on the ethical guidelines front. So India came up with its first policy on ethical guidelines in 1980, and then ICMR passed the guidelines in 2000, which were again revised in 2006. In 2005, the rules on clinical trials of new drugs were amended, which worked unreasonably in the favor of private sector. So since 2005, India had actually become a hotspot for Western pharmaceutical companies for conducting clinical trials. So since 2005, many incidents of clinical trials took place which were conducted beyond the bounds of ethics. For example, in 2010, survivors of Bhopal gas tragedy, they were included in at least 11 trials by making them sign informed consent forms without actually explaining what the trials were about. So the survivors actually believed they were being given some treatment, but actually they were included in a clinical trial. And during that trial, there were 10 deaths, which were reported like several months later. And most important thing was that some of the members of the ethics committee were the ones who were actually conducting those trials, which indicated a serious conflict of interest.
So, Sunila, sorry, what you're saying is that the survivors did not know that they were getting an experimental therapy. They thought they were getting a proven therapy, right?
Yeah. And in another example, in Andhra Pradesh and Gujarat, hundreds of minor tribal girls were included in HPV vaccine trial, and the consent was not given by their legal guardians. The trial was conducted based on an illegal consent given by their hostel warden. And the most shocking thing was that the legal guardians were not even made aware of their participation in the trial. They only came to know after a few participants died during the course of the trial. These were some of the incidents that pushed the ICMR to revise its guidelines further. And in 2017, it came up with the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants. So that was the history of how the ethical guidelines have been revised until now in India.
I think if you can just summarize this, ethics is something that seems very common sense to all of us. I mean, I think if you ask anybody about doing a clinical trial and you say that, hey, you have to respect the rights of the person who's being trialed, you would say that obviously, right? That would have been your first reaction. However, what we have seen repeatedly in history, and not just in India, but in other countries as well, is that the incentives are aligned in such a way that they sometimes do not always run in parallel with the context, and therefore we see a misalignment of the ethics of a particular study. And I think this context in India is particularly relevant, where we see patients having a lot of faith in the doctor and not enough education or not enough access to resources to figure out the risks of a particular experimental therapy themselves. I've attended these group discussions with doctors where they would say that, hey, look, the patient doesn't really want to even understand what's happening. They just say, Doctor Saab, aap jo bole wo, or whatever you said, doctor, I have faith in you, right? And hence it is very important that the accountability of the ethics falls on to the scientist who's doing the study and the ethics committee. But on the other hand, the way our guidelines are structured is in the way that you get consent and you are risk free, right? The patient has agreed to undergo trial, and therefore they understand the risk, and therefore they have taken the risk onto themselves. And I think that is the fundamental problem with our clinical trial guidelines that have been evolved so far.
Okay, so Shambhavi and Sunila, thanks for taking us through, how the history has had so many instances, and that probably has given us enough platform to look at it from a global perspective and the Indian context, right? But getting onto the ICMR guidelines itself, what are the things that you could highlight and tell that's probably good to kind of continue with, or that went really well?
Yes. So the versions before the 2017, they didn't have any sections included on public health and social and behavioral sciences research. But now the 2017 version has those sections, as well as detailed sections on informed consent, vulnerability, responsible code of conduct, and research during humanitarian emergencies. Now, it is very important to note that public health and social and behavioral sciences research has been included in these guidelines, because through these types of research, a lot of sensitive information comes out. Because in public health and social sciences research, we conduct a lot of qualitative research as well, wherein we have discussions with vulnerable populations such as persons living with HIV or sex workers. And a lot of sensitive content comes out of it. And we really need to protect these populations and the information that comes from them. So it is a really good thing that the ICMR guidelines has included these kinds of research as well. And they have a list of 12 principles, which the principle sections clearly highlights the need to review the essentiality of including humans in the research, unbiased selection of participants so that the benefits and burdens are evenly distributed, and having institutional mechanisms to facilitate transparency and accountability. There's also a principle for social responsibility, which implies for the researcher to be culturally and socially sensitive while designing the study. And also a principle for environmental protection, which encourages the researchers to be respectful of the environment and the biodiversity it houses. Another good thing about the guidelines is that it has a detailed section on informed consent, which states that the decision to be part of the research study or to withdraw from it solely lies on the participants, and it clearly lists out all the important components of informed consent. What should be the responsibility of researchers in that context, and what could be the special situations where the informed consent forms might need to be modified. Also, another important thing is the inclusion of vulnerable population section in the research, because the guidelines recognize the special considerations needed to protect those populations. By vulnerable populations, I mean children, elderly people, sex workers, people who are infected with HIV, prisoners, so those kinds of population. The guidelines also address the issue of conflict of interest as well, and direct the institutions to have mechanisms to identify and address this. So there are many things that the guidelines have got.
Great. I think you've kind of, summarized that well. But if we had to, categorically look at laying out the issues with the guidelines itself, right? Can we talk about the risks and everything that would seem not so great about it?
So along with the good things about the guidelines, yes, we of course need to look at the issues as well. So the first and foremost issue with the guidelines is that there is no distinction between procedural and normative ethics. So when I say normative ethics, it means the fundamental principles and values that govern the moral decisions. For example, in the guidelines, all types of research included state that the ethics committee should get a subject expert, review all the study procedures, conduct benefit risk assessment, and so on, which are all procedural ethics. But the ethical issues that are mentioned along with it do not go into the depth of what the conflicting sides could be. So it takes the focus away from the normative ethics. Also, the principles that are mentioned in the guidelines, they do not provide any examples or ethical dilemmas that may actually help in understanding what the essence of that principle is. So it's really hard to distinguish procedural ethics from normative ethics. Another issue is that ethical concerns of some types of research are not mentioned at all. For example, there's this section on monitored emergency use of unregistered and experimental interventions, which is also known as MURI. So it has a section on that, but it doesn't even explain what the particular ethical concerns could be or even what it entails. So what MURI means is that under normal circumstances, potential interventions, they go through clinical trials to establish their safety and efficacy in humans. However, during emergencies, like the one we are in right now, the COVID-19 emergency, there is not always enough time for clinical trials to happen. So experimental interventions are sometimes approved in such emergencies when there is no proven effective treatment. So this implies the use of off-label drugs, wherein the drugs are used for treating conditions that they are not otherwise approved to treat. When you are using a drug which is not approved to treat that condition under normal circumstances, there are bound to be some ethical issues related to it. But the guidelines, they do not explain what MURI is or what the concerns are. So there are a number of concerns associated with it. First is there is probability of manufacturers using this as an opportunity to market these drugs, which may result in haphazard and unregulated use of off-label drugs. Also, the use of the decision to use off-label drugs, it depends entirely on the doctor's discretion. So there are chances of the patients not being informed properly. And the guidelines actually make it clear that informed consent is a must and fair distribution of drugs should be ensured. However, in spite of the guidelines clearly mentioning that informed consent is a must, there was a recent incident of the violation of these guidelines by the ICMR itself. So on March 22nd, the ICMR released an advisory saying that hydroxychloroquine can be used as a prophylactic for healthcare workers and persons directly in contact with COVID-19 patients. However, at that point of time, no study had proved the safety and efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in prophylactic or curative capacity. In fact, studies conducted in France and China, they didn't even have good results associated with the study. And after the advisory was released, many hospitals directed their staff to take hydroxychloroquine without informing them about its potential side effects or even the fact that it is an experimental drug. And surprisingly, the advisory mentioned nothing about informed consent. And when Mumbai's government hospital ran out of HCQ supply, the staff got anxious as they thought they would be left out from being protected against COVID-19, and some of them even went to the pharmacies to buy HCQ on their own. So there was serious violation of ethical guidelines here. When ICMR's bioethics was contacted, they said that the 2017 guidelines were not applicable to the prophylactic use of hydroxychloroquine. But many bioethics experts have disagreed and said that the ethical guidelines are meant exactly for situations like these, and that the ICMR is violating its own guidelines. So if we look at this, clearly the principles of voluntariness, risk minimization, non-exploitation, transparency, and accountability, they all were violated here. This incident is concerning because ICMR was the one who formulated these guidelines, and they were the ones who violated these guidelines. So I think this is of concern here.
So while Sunila has laid out so much of information in terms of examples also being cited, do you think that a lot of it would have gone unnoticed only for the reason that now we have COVID-19 and we're all kind of tuning into this kind of studies and where are the risks? There might be a lot of it happening in the background and we wouldn't have really seen the outcome, but this has essentially happened because, say, an HCQ got administered, or it's out in the newspaper all the time. The media is capturing the COVID-19 kind of situation, right? So, Sunila, do you think it's just an outcome of the crisis, or this has been happening and it's probably not got the kind of importance it needs?
Definitely, that could be the case. I mean, because COVID-19 has been in the news so much, we are getting to know many things that are happening which are beyond ethical boundaries. So, I mean, definitely there might be cases that might have violated the guidelines, but we didn't know any better. But because since COVID-19 has got all the attention that it has, so yeah, probably this might not be the only example. There might be other instances as well.
All right. And ICMR guidelines that way is more like a living document, right? Like you kind of keep improving on it. Say the pandemic is something like we have discussed in the past also, where we have said that maybe we were not yet, we had not prepped up enough, we were not ready for a pandemic, and we lost sight of being in a situation like this, and that's why we didn't look at healthcare systems being, prepared for it, right? So similarly, this being a document which kinds of goes through changes based on certain situations that, the healthcare system throws at it, there is scope to keep improving on it, or there is a lot of rigidity and it takes time to kind of bring in these changes?
Yeah, guidelines are easier to modify, so it's not like a law which needs parliamentary approval. So in many cases, you can have new policies, new guidelines coming in as a reaction to a certain ongoing incident. What we have seen, what is problematic is the fact that the way the guidelines are written and their interpretation is what is crucial, and that has become somehow misguided in the past few months. And so clarifications, I think, on that would be really helpful. What we have again seen with the guidelines is that, like Sunila was saying, they're all very procedural. So it doesn't answer the crux of the point that is the experiment that I'm doing ethical or not, and ethical or not under a normal condition, and ethical or not under a condition which is a public health emergency. And that is something that the guidelines really fail to answer.
Fair enough. And moving on to the ethical guidance questionnaire itself, right? The kind of principles that it has, and maybe the current one has 12 and we're proposing 8. So Sunila, if you could kind of take us through what is it that you have suggested and go into the details of it.
Yes. Through this document, I have proposed 8 principles as opposed to the 12 ethical principles that are there in the existing guidelines. What I have done is I have clubbed few of the principles. So, for example, in the original guidelines, the risk minimization and maximization of benefits, they are 2 different principles here. But in my document, I have suggested combining them both because it is better to see those 2 principles in tandem. The basic principle of beneficence applies to this, which implies not just protecting the participants from the harm, but also securing their well-being. So it is essential for researchers to decide when the benefits justify the risks involved or when the benefits should be forsaken because of the risk. And in the current guidelines, they have principles for professional competence, institutional arrangements, transparency and accountability, and totality of responsibility, which I have clubbed them under the one principle of transparency and accountability, because transparency and accountability imply the rest three as well. So this principle refers to the availability of mechanisms that ensure studies are conducted and approved by professionally competent researchers and ethics committees respectively. And there should be institutional arrangements to hold everyone involved in conducting the research accountable in cases of misconduct or malpractices. Following those 8 principles, I have come up with a set of questions which will help in realizing if the principles are being followed or not. So these are the questions that the researchers should ask themselves while designing and conducting the study, and the ethics committees need to consider while approving the studies. The list of questions that I have provided is not an exhaustive list, and the questions may be modified or added depending on the type of research that is being conducted. To explain the ethical guidance questionnaire, I'll not go through the entire list because it's a long list, but I'll give you some of the examples. For example, the principle of autonomy, there are certain questions that should be considered, such as, is the study explained in a comprehensive and clear manner so that the participants can decide whether to volunteer or not for the study. This also implies if the study is being explained to the participants in their regional language if required. So it is very necessary to understand if the participant has actually clearly understood all the aspects of study before signing the informed consent form. Because otherwise the informed consent loses its meanings if the participant has not really comprehended what is being included in the study. Other questions that need to be considered has care been taken that the participants' autonomy is not compromised and that they have not volunteered under coercion or undue influence. For vulnerable populations who cannot exercise autonomy, such as children or mentally disabled people, are appropriate guardians identified for obtaining informed consent? Are the participants regularly updated about the progress of study so that they have the agency to withdraw if they are not comfortable with the way the research is progressing? So this was for principle of autonomy. For transparency and accountability, we need to consider if the results of the research will be shared with the participants and be made available on public platforms. Are the conflicts of interest disclosed and resolved before starting the study, and if any, during the study? Are there independent mechanisms to hold all those involved in conducting the study accountable? So these are examples of few of the principles and the questions that need to be considered along with those principles, so that it is easier to understand if we are following those principles.
Great. Thanks, Sunila, for that almost detailed version of what the questionnaire entails. Now, coming to the concluding remarks, Shambhavi, Sunila, would you like to say something as a concluding remark?
Yes. So what we need to understand is that while procedural ethics are to be followed as they are, the ethical principles, they will not always have answers ready for researchers. They should be used as a framework for making tough decisions in times of ethical dilemmas. So you're not gonna get fixed answers like, oh, am I being in the ethical? So the guidelines are not going to give you specific answers, but they are going to help you to find those answers. So we need to keep that in mind. And like the ethical principles, they should serve as a framework to guide the judgment of a researcher. And the primary aim of the guidelines should be to ensure welfare and safety of participants with whom the researchers work. At the end, the implementation of guidelines, it needs to be strengthened at administrative and institutional levels so that we have better social outcomes of the research.
Great. Thanks, Shambhavi and Sunila, for being on this episode. Just to let our listeners know, we have our upcoming deep webinar event happening this Friday, 5:30 to 6:45 on the India-Sri Lanka relations, the way forward. So if you would like to register, you could visit our website and there's a bit.ly link that you need to register with, and look forward to have you at the event. Thank you so much, Shambhavi and Sunila, for being there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sowmya.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. So Jasleen Royal came on Storytellers and Storytellers this week with Vineet. It was a really interesting conversation. Do definitely check that out. Hamsini Hariharan is back on the Pragati podcast after an extended absence. Hamsini was one of the original hosts along with Pravan, but she was unable to continue. But we're glad to have her back. She's talking about her experiences since she left. She's been studying in China. Definitely check that out. You'll enjoy that. Abhijit Ganguly was on Cyrus Says a couple of weeks ago, and he had such a great time, and we were so happy to have him on that we asked him to join us for Cock and Bull, and he was on this week. Do check that out. And lastly, I'd like to mention our Tamil show. We've been doing a show called Kadai Podcast Punyan Selvan, hosted by Kavita Jiva. She has been phenomenal. She's rewritten the stories in a way which really, they speak to a modern audience. But Punyan Selvan is over, and she has started a new story, though. The new story that she started is Sivakamiyan Sabatham. I'm sure I mangled that pronunciation, and I'm sure you'll love it if you're a Tamil speaker. Do definitely check it out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.